Has martyrdom ever been important in Confucian history?
Several Confucian literati have come to be known as martyrs. They died because those in power would not countenance their calls for greater justice in the imperial regime. One such figure was Yang Jishen, 1516-55 CE. So strong was his conviction that the imperial system would respond to good faith Confucian criticism that he risked all to denounce a corrupt official at court. Yang meticulously crafted his case against Yensung and his son, fasting for 3 days before presenting his charges. Yensung managed to poison the emperor's mind against Yang, implicating him falsely in a conspiracy. Yang languished in prison for 3 years while fellow literati attempted to defend him at court. All appeals lost, the heroic Yang refused to take a sedative before being tortured in prison. Before he was executed, he composed a short poem, in true literati style. In it he expressed the hope that he would live on in spirit. Still loyal to the emperor and grateful for his life of service. What is essential to note here is this martyr's dedication to advancing society through selfless commitment to justice in public administration, an outstanding feature of the Confucian spirituality of service.
What rites do worshippers practice in Daoist and CCT temples?
One of the most important and easily observable temple rituals involves the offering of incense. Worshippers buy 3 slender sticks of incense at a small temple shop that supplies a variety of materials for different sorts of offerings. Devotees can make their offerings either at the main altar or at any of a number of side or subordinate altars. Depending on the size of the temple and which deity they choose to address. Those who wish to worship at the main shrine may first approach the large incense kettle that normally stands in the central courtyard. Igniting their incense sticks, they hold them upright between folded hands. Wave them before the deity, and bow from the waist toward the object of their devotion. After prayer they insert the handles of the burning incense wands into the sand and ashes in the kettle. On some occasions a devotee might have his or her sticks placed in a holder on an altar. Some take incense ash home for use as a curative medicine. Equally important is a more ritually generic type of devotional prayer in which devotees supplicate the various deities for favors. Worshippers generally kneel to address the chosen deity, praying either aloud or in silence, either bowing humbly or looking at the image. Offerings other than incense include a variety of foods. Most commonly fruits, rice, vegetables, wine, and sweets. When worshippers make such offerings, they often have a temple staff member light a candle for them on the altar. Toward the end of a typical episode of temple worship, devotees will burn symbolic imitation paper money as an offering. All temples provide one or more small furnaces in which Worshippers offer gold paper to the deities and silver to ancestors. These burnt offerings symbolize personal sacrifice in hope of blessing and commitment to the ongoing well-being of departed family members.
Should Christians keep the Mosaic Law? How much of it? Did that include circumcision? Should they continue to go to the temple in Jerusalem?
Leaders convened a council or conference in Jerusalem around the year 48 CE. To work out the most vexing of these problems, Acts of the Apostles 15. A group of Pharisees among them insisted on imposing Jewish law and custom intact. But the majority opted to retain only basic dietary, ritual, and ethical constraints. A majority resolved to preach the gospel to non-Jews, arguing that the Hebrew scriptures enjoin such universality. The founding of Christianity was far less the result of a clear one-time decision than the gradual evolution of a set of views and practices that the leaders representing the various local communities judged consistent with their emerging identity. Sage of Jesus to all people. The story adds that he was blinded and forced to fast for 3 days until a Christian named Ananias laid hands on him and restored his sight, after which he was baptized. The usual date assigned to this event is between 34 and 36 CE. During the next 15 years Paul undertook 3 extensive journeys in the eastern Mediterranean region, preaching to the Gentiles particularly. Between the beginning of these missionary journeys and his martyrdom in Rome in 66 or 67 CE, he wrote a number of letters that became part of the Christian New Testament. Paul's teaching rested on 3 main principles: Jesus is the Son of God and the Messiah foretold by the prophets of Israel. By his death, Jesus atoned for the sins of all and opened heaven for humanity. The Mosaic Law had, by the fact of Jesus' death and resurrection, been abrogated and replaced by the law of Jesus. There was, therefore, no longer any distinction between Jew and Gentile. Paul frequently used texts from the Old Testament to argue his points, interpreting them according to the rabbinic method of exegesis that he had learned in Jerusalem. As the first systematic theologian and writer of the Christian faith, Paul wielded great influence on such medieval theologians as Saint Albertus Magnus, Saint Anselm and Saint Thomas Aquinas. Paul's writings also provided the 16th century reformers with their basic ideas. These religious thinkers preferred to return to Paul's text rather than to adhere to the metaphysical speculations that had developed in Christianity throughout 1,500 years.
Latin became the sacred language of most of what is the Lord's Prayer.
The Lord's Prayer, or the Our Father, is found in the Gospels of Matthew, 6:9-13, and Luke, 11:2-4. Both Gospels position the Lord's Prayer as Jesus' response To his disciples' request to teach them how to pray. Based on linguistic studies, most biblical scholars today agree that this prayer likely came from Jesus' own lips, "Our Father, who art in heaven. Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen." Western Christendom until the Reformation. Resulting in the use of Europe's vernaculars as standard practice of many Protestant churches. Greek continued as the language of the Byzantine Rite. But among the Eastern churches the equivalent of vernacular usage eventually became more common. Russian Orthodoxy and related churches preferred Old Slavonic as their sacred liturgical tongue. Today, vernacular languages dominate Christian liturgical practice. Some churches retain the ancient tongues for the most sacred part of the liturgy, namely the Eucharistic prayer in which the sacred species, bread and wine, are consecrated. A few very small Roman Catholic churches have sought to revive the use of Latin for the entire Mass. Change to exclusive use of vernaculars in most communities has been designed to increase participation and intelligibility for the congregation. But some argue that this has emptied the sacred action of its sense of mystery.
Could you describe an example of an annual CIT ritual occasion in greater detail?
At the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, a major event occurred at the winter solstice. Preparations commenced 2 months in advance. With 5 days to go, authorities inspected the animals to be offered. The next day they prepared the hall in which the emperor would spend a day in spiritual preparation. And the day after that the emperor began his abstinence. A procession made its way from the Forbidden City to the temple. Commoners taking care not to look at the royal person as he passed by. The emperor spent that day and night in the so-called Hall of Abstinence, a large complex to the west of the main north-south axis and about halfway between the altar of heaven to the south and the Hall of Harvest Prayer at the north of the compound. He bathed ritually and fasted for a day. Later emperors often prepared in the Forbidden City itself. 2 days before the solstice, ritualists made final preparation of all ceremonial objects for the emperor's review. The day before the solstice, the emperor left the Hall of Abstinence and proceeded to the altar of heaven to honor Shangdi and his own royal forebears with incense and bowing, and then returned the Hall of Abstinence. Early the next day, he began a 9-part ceremony. At the round altar of heaven, where his ancestors' spirit tablets were arrayed, animals were sacrificed and he paid obeisance to the ancestors. Offerings included silk and jade as well as the sacrificial meats. To music and dancing, he presented wine to Shangdi and the spirits in the first of 3 such offerings. After the emperor bade the sacred presences farewell, he withdrew to an observation dais. While officials consigned the offerings to a furnace. The ceremonies ended with the emperor exiting by the south gate and returning to the forbidden city.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Shinto practitioners?
Shinto has been influential in Japanese life through a relatively small number of specific and well-defined beliefs. Ancient tradition teaches the sacredness of nature and of the existence of specific individual and personal divine beings, including those mentioned in myths. Some of those divine beings have had universal importance throughout Japan and the history of Shinto. Others have been of more regional or local importance. The teaching with perhaps the most significant cultural implications is that of the divine ancestry of the emperor. Other important elements of the myth that one could call doctrinal have to do with the divine origins of Japan itself and the essential need of ritual purity. Across Japan and over the centuries, many other doctrine-like features have been important. But Shinto never has been a dogmatic tradition in that it has not explicitly made adherence to a specific set of doctrines a standard for membership in the community of believers. Far more significant has been the standard of participation in community through its vast complex of ritual practices. Those rituals are in turn deeply rooted in the primal myth.
What did the Jewish state declared on May 14, 1948?
In the 1930s, the world's Jews could see that the survival of European Jews depended on mass immigration to Palestine and to friendly states. This humanitarian imperative, however, was rejected by Britain and by those countries, like the United States, where Jews might conceivably have found a home. Faced with Hitler's hatred on the one hand, and world indifference on the other, the world's Jews realized the absolute need for a Jewish homeland. A sovereign state where Judaism was not only a religion, but a nationality. With the proclamation of an independent Jewish state on May 14, 1948, for the first time since the destruction of the Temple and the dispersion of the Jews, Jewishness became a national as well as a religious identity. By the law of return, every Jew had a right to Israeli citizenship. Thus the State of Israel had become a solution to the problem of the Jews, whose history since the dispersion had been one of trauma and tragedy. In medieval England the Jews had been expelled, in 15th century Spain they had endured the same fate. In most cases, Jews could not achieve political equality in the lands where they settled, and they lacked a land they could call their own and to which they could return. The proclamation of an independent Israel was the signal for a combined attack by the Arab states. After initial setbacks and mixed success, the Israelis were able to create a national army and to arm it, to an extent, with modern weapons. As a result of these efforts, the tide of battle gradually turned, and, by the end of 1948, Israeli forces led a campaign through southern Palestine and even into Egypt itself. In a later thrust, an Israeli column drove down to the Red Sea, securing the port of Eilat. During one of several ceasefires, Count Folke Bernadotte af Wisborg, the United Nations mediator, was assassinated by Zionist terrorists. Finally, by July 1949, armistice agreements were signed with the Arab states.
What does the term dual Shinto mean?
Dual, or Ryobyu, two-sided, Shinto arose out of the early interaction between Shinto theology and Buddhist thinking newly imported from China. Some use the term Ryobyu-shigo, dual compromise, to describe the resulting syncretism. Some accounts describe the developments this way. In 715 CE, a Shinto shrine annexed a Buddhist temple. 20 years later, a smallpox epidemic created a crisis, to which the emperor responded by commissioning the colossal Great Buddha, Daibutsu, at Nara's Todaiji temple. At the same time, the ruler dispatched the Buddhist patriarch Gyiji to Ise shrine to seek the blessing of Amaterasu, the Shinto sun goddess. Gyiji secured a favorable oracle, and the next night the emperor had a dream in which Amaterasu identified herself as the Mahayana Buddha of infinite light, Vairocana. This laid the groundwork for further identification of the various kami as alter egos of various Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. In 750, an image of the Shinto war kami, Hachiman, was transported from its shrine at USA on the island of Kyushu, just south of the main Japanese island, Honshu, to Todaiji in Nara so that the kami might pay respects to the Daibutsu. Hachiman thereafter remained in a special shrine at Todaiji, where he became the guardian kami of Todaiji Temple. Thus did a Shinto kami come to protect the teachings of the Buddha. This account reflects an interpretation formulated during the 9th century by teachers of a new esoteric school of Buddhism called Shingon. As always, this theological accommodation had its political implications, and set the stage for many years of Buddhist growth and royal patronage. From then on until 1868, dual Shinto was the dominant form of Shinto. With the Meiji restoration of imperial power came increasing pressure from Shinto scholars to purge the tradition of all Chinese influences, including of course Buddhism and Confucianism, both of which had by turns exerted considerable pull at court for many years.
What is the Kabi and why is it important?
According to tradition, Abraham and his son Ishmael built, or perhaps rebuilt, A simple cube-like structure in what came to be the center of the city of Mecca. During Muhammad's time the Kaaba was a relatively small structure, about 15 feet tall. With a black stone, the size of a bowling ball, of, perhaps, meteoric origin built into one of its corners. Rebuilt several times since Muhammad's day, the Kaaba now stands about 43 feet high. With irregular sides ranging from 36 to 43 feet. During Muhammad's lifetime, the building is said to have housed some 360 idols. In 630, Muhammad cleansed the Kaaba, and it has since remained empty except for some lamps. Its holiness as a symbol of divine presence derives largely from its associations with the lives of Abraham and Muhammad.
How and where do members of local Hindu communities come together?
Local and regional temples are the major gathering places. Hindus use religiously and socially and support financially. Individual temples in India are generally dedicated predominantly to a particular deity. Most center around some aspect or manifestation of Shiva or Vishnu, or one of their major female consorts or counterparts. A temple will typically also have subordinate shrines dedicated to other names and forms of the central deity. Some smaller local temples may also belong exclusively to sex-worshipping deities largely unknown outside the area. Most temples draw sectarian client. In many regions outside India, however, greater diversity in the makeup of local communities often requires greater flexibility in the religious orientation of temples. For example, Indian immigrants around American cities such as Pittsburgh and St. Louis come from various places in India and represent a variety of sectarian backgrounds. As a result, the temples that serve the regions are sensitive to a wider spectrum of devotional needs than might be the case at a local temple in an area where Hindus are in the majority and where one sect predominates. Large temples in both Pittsburgh and St. Louis have been funded by Indian populations largely of immigrants from South India. Both temples are therefore dedicated to a popular South Indian manifestation of Vishnu called Sri Venkateshvara, Lord of the Sin-Forgiving Hill. But in order to serve the diverse local population, both temples include prominent devotional symbolism familiar both to Shaivites and to Vaishnavites.
Do Buddhists mark their sacred spaces with any distinctive signs and symbols?
Though Buddhist ritual spaces vary a great deal architecturally and decoratively from one region to another, a number of commonly used signs and symbols appear. Perhaps the single most important is the eight-spoked wheel of the Dharma, reminder of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path. Tibetan temples identify themselves with a characteristic form of the classical Indian stupa called a chorten. A five-level architectural form crowned with a conical shape. Chinese Buddhist temples borrowed their ground plans from the traditional royal residence. A walled enclosure with one or more interior courtyards surrounding the main sacred structures. The principal inner structures face south and are lined up on an axis with the main gate. A multi-storied polygonal pagoda may be part of the complex. Japan largely borrowed the classical Chinese ground plan, varying the placement of the inner buildings somewhat. Always found at the back of the walled enclosure is the main image hall where central rituals occur. 3, 5 or 7-story square pagodas are irregular. Feature in the main courtyard of many Japanese temples. Thai temples feature a very distinctive roofline and post very imposing guardian figures before the main door but do not generally have separate pagoda structures.
What has been the shaman's role in Daoism?
Remnants of ancient shamanism continue to color much Daoist religious thought and practice. In pre-Daoist times, shamans were tribal leaders possessed of extraordinary powers. Reports from around the 3rd century BCE describe how these fangshi or masters of prescriptions worked their magic. They could tap natural energies, exercise control over life and death, and assume the form of various powerful creatures. Shamanic specialists included many women as well as men. With the dawn of empire and agricultural economy, shamans became part of the governmental structure. Their duties included drawing spiritual powers to themselves as they entered into trance. Exorcism, explaining omens and dreams, influencing the weather for favorable harvest. Curing the sick, and divining heavenly portents at the behest of the emperor. A transformed shamanism lives on in various Daoist practices that are generally divided among the Black Hat priests, Red Turban Masters, and spirit mediums. Daoist ritual specialists still fend off evil spirits and perform a vestige of the ancient ceremonies symbolizing the shaman's journey to the upper and lower worlds. That spiritual journey of ascent and descent remains perhaps the most distinctive survival of shamanistic lore. It appears in various traditions in surprising forms, including, for example, Muhammad's famous night journey and ascension. Daoist ritual symbolism of the journey occurs in the masters pacing the clouds as he prepares the sacred space for the great religious observances.
What is holy?
Originally a fertility festival, this late winter celebration of several days, ending with the full moon of Fulguna, is named after the demoness Holika. She was in the habit of eating a child each day until a holy widow summoned all the children to curse the demoness together. Amid great hubbub, participants today let out the kind of energy the children must have unleashed on Holika. They throw multicolored powders and liquids on each other. Evidently a visual remnant of the children's curses. By a fascinating process of association, the celebration has also come to embrace the mythological downfall of evil female figures. For example, Krishna destroyed the demoness Putana, whom the evil king Kamsa had sent, disguised as a wet nurse, to kill the infant deity by poisoning him with her breast milk.
Do Confucians believe in miracles?
Some have described Confucian teaching as philosophical in content and religious in function. As such, Confucian tradition focuses on the role of humanity in the greater scheme of things. It does not deny the existence of a divine realm or the power of beings who inhabit that realm. Instead, it emphasizes the importance of each human being's full acceptance of his or her responsibility. About the rest we cannot know in detail. What we have to work with are the myriad small realities we confront every day. Countless wonders await anyone willing to observe carefully each detail of ordinary life. Confucius would not have approved of any approach to life that amounted to waiting for the gods to do what human beings alone are responsible for. As such, Confucian teaching is highly realistic. It does not deny the possibility of miracles, events beyond the ordinary. It merely suggests that people who are genuinely attentive to life as it unfolds already have more than enough to occupy them. Many devoutly religious people think of miracles as the ultimate cause for gratitude.
Are there Shinto hierarchical structures?
Like so many other religious traditions, Shinto community structures often reflect the belief that human life mirrors divine life. Just as there is at least an implicit hierarchy among divine beings, human society needs a certain degree of structure. Long-standing Japanese tradition, much influenced and reinforced by Confucian teaching over the centuries, lays great emphasis on knowing one's place in society. Each individual stands in a relationship of higher to lower, or vice versa, with his or her fellow human beings. And basic etiquette requires that one be aware of social subordination in every context. Everyday Japanese speech, with its various levels of polite address, reflects that awareness. Although contemporary Japan is a democratic society, with all the political institutions needed to support a democracy, hierarchy runs deep in the culture, and so too in Shinto belief and practice. Everything, from ranks within the network of shrines to division of labor among ritual specialists, mirrors that awareness of multi-level structure in society at large. For several centuries in the early history of Shinto, 4 groups were responsible for most Shinto ritual. The Nakatomi family oversaw ritual generally, the Imbe family were concerned with maintaining ritual purity. The Urabe family focused on divinatory rituals so as to know the divine intentions in all matters. And shrine musicians performed the divine entertainments. Other powerful clans or families held and relinquished positions of power and influence over subsequent centuries.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Confucians or in CIT?
Ancient tradition gave the generic name Ryuchya, the teaching of the scholars, to a way of thinking and performing rituals that predated Confucius. Confucius inherited the way of that imperial cult, which included elaborate sacrificial ceremonies addressed to heaven and earth as part of the overall worldview. Described in the section on Daoism as that of yin and yang. After Confucius' time, the great teacher's interpretation of that traditional heritage came to be known as the teaching of Confucius, Kongqia. Throughout the long histories of both Confucianism and CIT, Chinese have been aware of various elements in their teaching that in effect form a body of doctrine. Rarely, if ever, has either Confucianism or CIT shown any tendency toward dogmatic pronouncements meant to serve as a litmus test by which to measure the allegiance of the public. Some scholars talk of a kind of orthodoxy in the Neo-Confucian schools of the Song and later dynasties. But in general a broad acceptance of a core body of teachings has simply been presumed.
How does the Buddhist tradition describe existence in general?
Buddhist teaching focuses on three fundamental qualities of all things. Two are fairly obvious to anyone who cares to look, and are at the heart of the experience of enlightenment. The first is hardship or suffering, the second impermanence. Nobody is immune to sadness and disappointment. No one has a lock on success and genuine contentment. And everything comes to an end. Everything. The third quality is far from obvious even to the most careful observer. But an awareness of it does follow from the realities of suffering and impermanence. That is the notion that there is no permanent, indestructible core or soul at the center of any being. Hindu tradition taught Siddhartha Gautama that at the center of each individual being was a self or Atman that survived physical death to be reincarnated in another life. Assuming the person died still enslaved by the effects of self-centered choices. The Buddha's reinterpretation of Hindu tradition on this point was so radical that it cuts right to the psychological bone.
Do millennialism or messianism have a place in Confucian thinking?
Confucius was far more concerned about the present and its relation to the past than about possible but distant futures. he was keenly interested in offering people hope through the cultivation of a balanced society. Some have suggested that Confucius was very much a utopian, in that the society he sought to foster was destined to remain an unattainable ideal. In any case, Confucius did not envision any kind of inevitable cataclysm, an end of time at which the world of history would implode in a cosmic conflagration. Confucian thought has been intimately associated with the traditional Chinese reckoning of time. That includes cycles of 60 years, but those cycles do not carry apocalyptic implications. There have been millennialist and messianic movements in Chinese history, but none of importance has arisen out of Confucian or literati circles. However, some scholars detect in Confucian history elements that have a messianic tone. According to that view, Confucius himself may have fulfilled expectations of a messianic ruler nurtured as far back as the legendary Shang dynasty.
What is the Christian feast of Easter about?
Christ chose to suffer death on the cross to save humanity from its sin. And Christ's victory over death fulfilled the promise of redemption. As the name suggests, Easter celebrates the rising of the Son of Life from the dark night of the grave. Christian tradition teaches that when a group of myrrh-bearing women and then the apostles went to the tomb on the third day after the crucifixion, they found the grave empty. Enemies of the early Christians argued that Jesus' followers had taken his body away to give credence to his predictions that he would rise from the dead. New Testament accounts in the Gospels and Acts of the Apostles narrate a number of post-resurrection appearances in which Jesus visited his disciples and spoke with them. The Eastern Christian year is organized entirely around Easter in 3 segments. 10 weeks prior to Easter, 50 days after Easter, and a more generic remainder of the year. Western churches generally accord the Christmas season a liturgical and spiritual importance equal to that of Easter.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Buddhist worship and prayer?
Among the most common implements used in regular ritual are acoustic devices such as bells, gongs, and hollow wooden blocks. Prayer leaders will occasionally strike a large bronze bowl-shaped bell set on a pillow. As its vibrant, mellow ring decays into silence, devotees recall the universal characteristic of impermanence. When ritual leaders, sometimes accompanied by the congregation, chant sacred texts, they generally strike a hollow block of wood rhythmically to keep chanters together in their recitation. Incense burners and containers of sand into which devotees can insert their lighted incense wands are part of nearly every ritual setting. Sometimes devotees will approach a temple's large incense cauldron, waft the smoke toward them with their hands, and then rub it on various parts of their bodies for healing and general well-being. Esoteric sects typically employ a larger variety of objects. Tibetans use a small scepter symbolizing the indestructibility of the thunderbolt in one hand. The other holds a small bell whose vanishing sound represents impermanence. Some groups use weapons associated with Hindu deities who became part of the Buddhist pantheon. Some also use a begging bowl, as the Buddha did, or a fly whisk, symbol of adherence to the Dharma. Most basic among the ritual objects in both home and temple are the candle holder. 1 for the home, 2 in temple, flower vase, 1 at home, 2 in temple, and small censer. Other common objects include tablets or scrolls containing sacred names or mantras, either in Sanskrit or the vernacular.
What is the ceremony of a Japanese wedding?
Contemporary Japanese weddings are celebrated in many ways, often combining traditional Japanese and Western elements side by side. Typically, a religious wedding ceremony is performed in Shinto style at a shrine located inside the hotel where the wedding celebration occurs. The ceremony is conducted by a Shinto priest and is attended only by the couple's closest family members. The couple is purified, drinks sake, and the groom reads a statement of commitment. The ceremony ends with symbolic offerings to the kami. The couple wears traditional Japanese garb. A reception is usually held after the ceremony. The wedding couple might welcome anywhere from 15 to 250 guests, relatives, friends, and co-workers. After the bride and groom are introduced, a meal is served and brief speeches are delivered. At the end of the party, the couple thank their guests for joining them on this important day. In recent years, many Japanese couples have incorporated traditionally Western elements into their weddings, for example, brides wearing white, Christian-style dresses. Sometimes the entire ceremony takes place in a Christian church and, according to a Christian-like ritual, even when the couple is not Christian. Many couples also perform other Western-style rituals, including cake cutting, an exchange of rings, and elaborate honeymoons.
Who are Roman Catholics?
As early as the 4th century, Christendom experienced political and religious tensions between Western, Latin, and Eastern, Greek, styles of theology and governance. These differences were magnified by the East-West division officially declared in 1054, with many Eastern communities, Orthodox or right-believing Christians, proclaiming themselves formally independent of Rome. But the use of the term Roman Catholic came into common use after the 16th century Protestant Reformation. Papal authority, an often contested issue during the previous millennium or longer, again became a critical question. The reformers protested against the Church's rigidly hierarchical structure. Officially a kind of oligarchy, but often in effect a monarchy in which the Pope enjoyed greater power than the College of Cardinals. The theological counterpart to the hierarchical system of internal governance were distinctively Roman. Teachings on the seven sacraments and on a vast multi-tiered celestial realm populated by saints and angels. Against these and other symbols of authority and mediated spiritual power, the Reformers emphasized the priesthood of the faithful and the unmediated relationship of each believer to God. In response, Roman Catholicism further defined itself through the decrees of the Council of Trent. 1545-63, and the Counter-Reformation. Spearheaded by the newly founded Society of Jesus or Jesuits, 1540, among other emerging religious orders. Today Roman Catholics constitute about half the number of Christians worldwide.
Is there a distinctively Confucian interpretation of history?
Confucius refused to think of himself as an innovator. Any individual bent on inventing his own system of thought was doomed to failure. So interdependent are we humans. His task, he believed, was what he called the renewal of antiquity. His first step was to translate his knowledge of tradition into clearly articulated principles, so that he could intelligently sort out the best of the past. Confucius discerned in the drift of history a serious problem of societal entropy, the tendency to let things unravel. Looking back to the legendary founders of Chinese society, Confucius believed the first major problem set in when the Xia dynasty, 1994 to 1525 BCE, instituted the principle of hereditary succession. When decline in the quality of the rulers reached a disastrous low, the Shang dynasty, 1525 to 1028 BCE, overthrew the last Xia tyrant. Unfortunately, the Shang rulers retained the hereditary throne, thus virtually sealing their own eventual demise. Sure enough, the Zhou dynasty, 1028 to 222 BCE, was destined to be the instrument of renewal. By the master's own time, the Zhou, too, showed signs of serious decay. The master wondered what power under heaven might again correct the course of history. Confucius was convinced that it was possible to imitate the eternally true in history, to avoid reliving all of the past by distinguishing the good from the evil in it. True authority arose out of the ability to blend the ancient with the new. And only through learning could a leader assimilate the eternally true to changing needs. Beginning with politics and ethics, Confucius set out to contribute to the renewal of antiquity.
Was Shinto associated with the samurai code?
Japan's fabled tradition of samurai warriors did have important connections with Shinto. But it did not arise out of Shinto alone or even primarily. Some credit a 17th century Japanese Confucian scholar and military theorist named Yamaga Soko. 1622 to 1685, as the originator of the way of the warrior, Bushido. Yamaga emphasized the importance of sincerity and utter devotion to the ancestral kami as a sure road to experiencing the divine presence. Along with other thinkers of his time, he focused on the concept of Amaterasu as the ancestral kami of the imperial family. Total devotion to the ancestral kami therefore implied perfect allegiance to the person of the emperor, the shogun, and the territorial feudal lords called daimyo. Feudal society depended on the loyalty of its samurai, the knightly or military class. Even after the shogunate and the feudal system gave way to a rejuvenated imperial government under the Meiji Restoration, military supporters of the emperor turned the code of unquestioning dedication to good effect by underscoring the necessity of unstinting affection for the royal person and his household.
Do Buddhists believe in an afterlife?
Although the Buddha himself emphasized the need to focus on this worldly concerns, his followers soon developed a complex understanding of the spiritual structure of the universe. According to both Theravada and Mahayana models, all of reality is divided into three realms. The realm of desire, Kamadhatu, encompasses everything from innumerable hells through the dwelling places of animals, humans, lesser gods, and the various paradises in which good people can expect to enjoy the fruits of a good life. Each level of hell is suited to a particular kind of selfishness and evil. The heavens are similarly graded for the enjoyment of the just. A certain sexist attitude is built into the notion of paradise, since in order to gain entry into the highest heaven women must first be reborn as men. Those reborn into the next major level up, the realm of form, Rupadhatu, leave behind the senses of taste, touch, and smell. Through hearing, sight, and mental impressions they continue the ongoing process of spiritual refinement and education. Denizens of this realm's multiple heavens, from 16 to 18, progress upward through various stages of contemplative discipline, arriving finally at the third cosmic realm, that of non-form, Arupadhatu. Dispensing with sight and hearing, dwellers in this realm progress through four aditonal heavens through meditation, arriving at last at nirvana. Beyond that, according to some Mahayana schools, lie several Buddha fields. Transcendent Buddhas, such as Amitabha, in China, Amida in Japan, reign over their individual Buddha fields. Amitabha's is the western paradise called the Pure Land. Popular belief suggests that devotees can bypass the lower intermediate steps and progress directly to this final abode merely by expressing perfect faith in the transcendent Buddha.
Is music important in Daoist and CCT ritual?
Music has been an essential ingredient in virtually all indigenous Chinese religious ritual for millennia. Students of Daoist masters are expected to begin their formal training by becoming accomplished in the use of a full range of string, wind, and percussion instruments. These ancient devices include not only the mysterious booming gongs and bowed or pluck strings many readers may already associate with Asian music, but the less well-known woodwinds whose high reedy voices produce an almost eerie effect. Daoist ritual music has been related to imperial court music and, somewhat more recently, Chinese opera. Ritual music aims at stirring feelings uniquely appropriate to the occasion. In these last several respects, Daoist ritual music has much in common with the music that is an essential ingredient in many Shinto ceremonies in Japan. Two percussion instruments used to keep time for chanting and recitation of scripture are virtually identical to those used for the same purpose in Buddhist ritual all over Asia. Large-scale chanting on especially solemn occasions is accompanied by an ensemble of 4 or more instruments of various types. Percussion instruments along with other wind and string instruments back up the lead played on oboe-like woodwinds, lutes, and bowed strings. When a single master recites a sacred text, a solo instrument is generally the only accompaniment.
Is there such a thing as Jewish fundamentalism?
Fundamentalist approaches to scriptural interpretation and to the conduct of life in general have been an ongoing reality in Jewish tradition and history. As far back as the last few centuries BCE, groups like the Sadducees and Karaites had rejected any traditional developments beyond the written scripture, going so far as to reject even scriptural texts apart from the Torah. In more recent times, a number of arch-conservative groups have asserted themselves, especially in Israel. The Gush Emunim or Bloc of the Faithful, for example, represent the concerns of a number of Israelis who have settled in the occupied West Bank, which is now part of negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. Jewish fundamentalism in this and other cases turns largely on a given group's literal insistence that the land is a divine and irrevocable gift, and must therefore be reclaimed and occupied by whatever means necessary.
Do Hindus have a system of religious law?
Surely the single most important Hindu religious concept is that of Dharma. As a universal notion, Dharma is the cosmic law that binds all things together. Each individual person also has his or her Dharma. The fundamental religious requirements and ethical expectations associated with each person's station in life. Classical Hindu sources also use the term Dharma in reference to countless specific moral duties and ritual rubrics. Treatises called Shastras are the principal repositories of the Hindu legal and ethical materials. They belong to the larger category of sacred literature called smrti, remembered. Revered as of divine origin, but subordinate in authority to shruti, heard, scriptures. The Dharmashastras, and related texts like the Grihaya Sutras that include detailed information on every facet of householder life. Derive ultimately from a text generally known as the Laws of Manu, dated variously from 600 BCE to 100 CE. The ancient law books have retained their authority well into modern times. Only recently have India's legislative bodies introduced serious and sweeping reforms. But the antiquity of tradition and inherent cultural resistance to change have kept many practices alive in spite of official attempts to adapt the classics to contemporary needs.
What are some basic clues about the iconography of the major deities?
Walk through the Asian galleries of your local museum, or visit a Hindu temple. And chances are good that you will spot some of the following images. Shiva's main symbol is the short pillar-like object called the linga, which, together with the female yoni, represents divine creative power. But you may also find Shiva Natraja, Dance King, surrounded by a ring of fire, cosmic flux, and trouncing the demon of ignorance. His upper right hand holds the drum whose sound is that of creation. His upper left the fire of destruction. His lower left points to the earth, the lower right raised in a gesture of reassurance. From his head flows the Ganges, whose fall to earth Shiva breaks with his matted locks. You may find his beloved mount, the bull Nandi, nearby. Shiva may also appear seated with his very voluptuous wife, Parvati, and their very human-looking son Skanda. There Shiva will hold an axe and a deer as symbols of his lordship over nature. You may also see the combined male and female Shiva Parvati called half-woman Lord, their other son. Ganesha, is the one with the elephant head and pot belly. He holds a bowl of sweets in one hand, and in the other one of his own tusks, which he is about to hurl at the demon who made fun of him. His vehicle is a mouse or rat, an obvious dash of humor. Vishnu may appear alone or with his wife, Lakshmi. He typically carries the conch shell, capable of making a world-shuddering sound, the discus, a weapon for cutting enemies off at the knees, and the mace, while raising a fourth hand in reassurance. Vishnu's most popular avatar, Krishna, frequently plays his world-charming flute, with his legs crossed jauntily in a dance step. His beloved Radha often appears with him. Rama is the second most important avatar, recognizable by his bow when standing alone, but usually seen in company of his wife Sita, his brother Lakshmana, and their faithful monkey assistant Hanuman.
Do practitioners of Shinto believe in miracles?
Check the index of almost any book about Shinto and you look in vain for the word miracle. That does not mean the tradition is entirely without interesting analogies to what many people mean by the term. Shinto recommends regular expressions of gratitude to the kami for their inestimable bounty. It also recommends prayer of petition for whatever worshippers may need. Many people believe that one ordinary role of the kami is to make the seemingly impossible possible. In a way, that is the essence of divine power. For worshippers regard the kami as nurturing protectors who look after the best interests of their devotees.
Do colors have symbolic meaning to Confucians? How about for CIT?
In Confucian tradition and CIT, as well as in other Chinese traditions generally, a set of 5 colors have special associations. Colors are paired with the 5 elements: wood, water, earth, metal, fire, and directions, yellow or gold in the center, black in the north, red in the south, green or azure in the east, and white in the west. Red and gold are particularly important in the decoration of the temples, reminders of the south and center. At the Temple of Heaven, the color azure and a kind of turquoise or aquamarine decorate the domical vault, suggesting an association of those colors with heaven. The Forbidden City is often described as a purple palace, connecting that color with royal power. Carpets spread out before the various thrones were typically yellow, the color for the center. Throughout the palace, roof tiles were yellow and columns red. Only the emperor's buildings could sport gold tiles. Red and gold were also the principal colors of royal garments. Reminders of the fire at the heart of the empire.
What do Daists believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
Daists call the ultimate spiritual reality Dao, the way. Long before the formal beginnings of Daoism's various movements and school, Chinese tradition used the term Dao as a general ethical notion implying the appropriate and moral way of acting. As so often happens when a religious tradition enters a new cultural setting, Buddhism's arrival in China led some thinkers to talk of a Buddhist way in contrast with which they began to define an indigenous Chinese way in the sense of religious beliefs and values. Daoist philosophers emphasized the unfathomable mystery of the Dao, but they viewed it as non-personal power rather than a personal divine entity. The religious equivalent seems to have been a deity called the Supreme Oneness, Tai Yi. The Dao De Jing's description of how the transcendent Dao became manifest suggests a type of emanation. Dao gave rise to the One, which produced the Two, and so on. That grand and uplifting description of the ultimate mystery still remained a bit too abstract for most people. As a result, when the first schools of religious Daoism began to formulate, their beliefs they naturally gravitated toward more concrete imagery. That included the deification of the individual, long believed to represent the way as an accessible teaching, namely Lao Zi. The process also led to personification of certain essential features of the mysterious Dao in the form of the heavenly triad called the Three Pure Ones. Developments of this sort multiplied, and the deities took on life stories and personalities that invited devotional interaction. In practice, the many personifications of divinity are arrayed according to an administrative structure parallel to that of the imperial bureaucracy. Religiously speaking, of course, the reality is just the other way round. The imperial institutions imitated the heavenly order of things.
Are there any Confucian or CIT holy sites or cities?
Confucian tradition spotlights a number of places associated with the lives of Confucius and other major sages and scholars. Only a year after Confucius' death, the Duke of Lu dedicated a temple to him in Khufu, 478 BCE. Within a few years, his tomb and temple in Khufu had become widely known holy places. As early as 195 BCE, an imperial sacrifice at the tomb further broadened Khufu's fame as a sacred site. Confucian tradition did not elevate any one city to prominence as a center of authoritative teaching. But certain cities were home to the great Confucian universities. The most important cities were always associated with the seat of imperial government. And that changed often through Chinese history, even during the tenure of a single dynasty. Beijing has been perhaps the most important Confucian city. It was the capital uninterruptedly for nearly 500 years. And Confucianism was highly favored and influential through virtually that whole period.
How did CIT structure its main ritual activities?
CIT rituals were arranged in a symbolic hierarchical order that coordinated the authority of those performing the rituals with the various ranks of the CIT pantheon. To symbolize universal dominion, the emperor would make offerings to the powers controlling all four cardinal directions, to all mountains and rivers, and to the 5 domestic sacrifices. On lower levels, ritual responsibilities reflected a division of labor and authority. Imperial princes made offerings only to the power ruling their own quarters of the universe and the associated mountains and rivers, and to the 5 domestic sacrifices. These took place at regional sacred sites. In turn, the prince's chief officers were to perform only the domestic offerings, and their subordinates only the offerings to their own ancestors. These last rituals occurred in home settings and in cemeteries. Specific rituals include many of the same kinds of actions deists or practitioners of CCT engage in. Ritual specialists generally purified themselves for the ceremonies by fasting and ablutions. before making offerings to divine powers of the top level in the pantheon. Specialists fasted for 3 days, and for second-level deities, 2 days. During times of fasting, ritualists were especially careful to avoid certain strong foods. Garlic and onions, and fermented beverages. An essential ingredient in the preparatory period was avoidance of contact with death and disease. Festivities and music were put aside. Central to the actual worship ceremonies was the offering of food, wine, and incense, along with prayers of petition and physical prostration before the deities.
What questions does the prospect of interfaith marriage raise for Shinto practitioners?
Many Japanese active in Shinto communities are also active in Buddhist circles. They do not draw the kind of clear boundaries between religious traditions that many members of other faiths may be inclined to draw. Traditional Japanese are therefore far less concerned with questions of religious affiliation than with cultural and ethnic identity. Significant numbers of Japanese would like to have their sons and daughters marry in a Shinto ceremony to keep ancient tradition intact. What is more important to many, however, is that their children marry other Japanese.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Jews?
Jewish tradition is generally more concerned with orthopraxy, correct practice, than with orthodoxy, correct opinion. Creedal statements such as the 13 Articles offer a convenient distillation of the heart of Jewish belief. But there have been few historical instances of prominent attempts to use adherence to a body of doctrine as a measure of membership. Even now, with ultra-Orthodox groups in Israel pressing the question of who has the right to call him or herself a Jew, the issue turns more on behavior than on belief. The most conservative elements claim that only religiously engaged Jews are truly Jews. But practical adherence to the halakha is the crux of the matter. There have been no major cases of Jewish inquisitions targeting false teachings.